The rain was falling hard in the small town, and the streets were quiet except for the sound of water running through the drains, and the occasional car passing slowly through the night air that carried the smell of wet concrete and the distant sound of a barking dog somewhere far away. And inside a small cafe, with yellow lights glowing against the dark windows, sat a man alone at the corner table writing numbers and strange shapes on a napkin, while his coffee sat untouched beside him, and the waitress gave him curious looks from behind the counter, wondering why he had been there for so long. At another table near the door sat FBI agent Riley Hart, her coat still damp from the rain, and her eyes sharp as she read through a file full of photographs and notes, each page a piece of the same terrible puzzle she had been trying to solve for months. And yet every clue seemed to lead to nothing, and every lead went cold before she could catch it, and the killer she hunted was clever enough to leave behind messages made of codes and patterns that no one in her team could break, and every day that passed without answers made her feel the weight of failure pressing down harder and harder on her. Riley lifted her eyes from the file and noticed the man in the corner, his brow furrowed and his hand moving quickly across the napkin, as if the pen could barely keep up with his mind, and she tilted her head curious, because she recognized the kind of focus she was seeing. It was the same kind she had seen in codebreakers and analysts in the bureau, people who could look at chaos and find order where no one else could, and something about the man's calm expression told her that he was not just passing the time, he was working on something important, even if it looked like a simple puzzle. The man was Ethan Cole, a single father who lived quietly on the edge of town with his young daughter Lily. He had once been a mathematics prodigy, a man whose IQ had been measured at 160, a man who had been offered jobs by universities and research centers, but had chosen instead to raise his daughter alone after tragedy had taken his wife away. He did not like attention, and he stayed away from crowds, spending most of his time doing freelance work and solving complex problems for companies that could afford his talent. But tonight, he was simply killing time with puzzles while waiting for the rain to slow down before heading home. Riley found herself studying the napkin from where she sat and saw a pattern forming in the numbers that made her heart beat faster. It was similar to the patterns the killer had been leaving at crime scenes, not identical, but close enough to make her wonder if this stranger could help her in a way no one else had. So she closed the file, picked up her coffee, and walked to his table, her boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Ethan looked up as she approached, his expression polite but guarded, and Riley smiled slightly as she gestured to the napkin, asking if she could sit. He nodded slowly, and she slid into the chair across from him, telling him that she could not help noticing the puzzle he was working on and asking what it meant. Ethan shrugged, saying it was just a way to pass the time, but Riley leaned forward, her voice low, as she said she had a case, one that no one had been able to solve, and that his mind might be exactly what she needed. Ethan raised an eyebrow, not sure if she was serious, and that was when Riley smirked and said the word that would change both their lives forever. "Solve my case, win my heart," she said, half joking, but with a spark in her eyes that made Ethan pause and study her, as if trying to read what kind of person would make a challenge like that, and why. There was a long moment of silence between them, the sound of rain filling the gap. And then Ethan set down his pen and told her he had no interest in games, but he did like a challenge. And if her case was truly as unsolvable as she claimed, then he would at least take a look at it. But he warned her quietly that puzzles like this could open doors neither of them might want to walk through, and that sometimes the truth was far worse than the mystery. Riley slid the file across the table and watched as Ethan began to read the first page, his eyes moving quickly, his mind already pulling at threads that no one else had seen, and she could see it happening right in front of her, the way his posture changed, the way his fingers tapped against the paper, as if counting the beats of an invisible rhythm. And she knew then that she had found something rare, someone who might actually be able to help her catch the ghost she had been chasing for so long. Outside, the rain kept falling, the night growing darker, and the cafe growing quieter as the other customers left, until it was just the two of them sitting with the file between them, and the air charged with something that was part curiosity, part danger, and part something neither of them could name yet. And in that moment, the unsolvable case began to shift ever so slightly toward a truth that would pull them both into a game far more dangerous than either one expected. The cafe was nearly empty now, and the rain had slowed to a light drizzle outside, but inside the air felt heavier, as Ethan kept turning page after page in the file, his eyes scanning each word, each picture, each piece of evidence, like a man searching for something only he could see, and Riley watched him closely, noting the way his brow tightened and his lips pressed together when something caught his attention. He stopped at one of the photographs, a picture of a crime scene with numbers scrawled in red marker on the wall beside the body, and he leaned closer, tilting his head like he was listening to a voice no one else could hear, and then he asked her how many of these messages had been found and whether the numbers ever repeated. Riley told him there had been 6 crime scenes, all with different codes, and no repeats in the numbers, but no one could find a pattern in them. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind already moving far ahead of her words, and he asked for a pen and some blank paper. Riley slid a small notepad across the table, and he began to write the numbers in neat columns, arranging them in a way that made no sense to her at all. And then he drew lines between certain numbers, like connecting stars in a constellation. After a minute, he tapped the page and told her the numbers were not random at all. They were dates, each pointing to something specific in the town's history. And Riley felt a small shiver run down her spine, because it meant the killer was not just choosing victims at random, but was working off a very deliberate plan. Ethan began listing the dates aloud, and Riley realized each one matched the anniversary of an old unsolved crime in town, some going back 20 years, some only 5, and every single one had been a case where justice had never been served. And Ethan looked up at her with an expression that was almost grim as he said whoever this killer was, they saw themselves as some kind of judge correcting old wrongs in their own twisted way. Riley asked how he could be so sure, and he said patterns were like fingerprints. No 2 people left them in the same way and the moment you found the pattern, you could predict the next move. And he told her the next date in the sequence would fall only 2 days from now, which meant they had very little time to stop whatever was coming. She felt the weight of his words settle over her, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed, and she answered quickly. It was her partner back at the bureau saying another coded message had been found earlier that day, but the local police had not linked it to the killer. Yet Riley told him to send her a photo, and when she showed it to Ethan, his eyes narrowed immediately. He pulled the paper closer and traced his finger along the numbers, murmuring to himself. Then he looked up and told her the location of the next crime, before she could even ask how he knew. And the name he gave her was an old abandoned train station on the edge of town, a place that had been empty for years, except for stray animals and the occasional trespasser. Riley asked if he was certain, and he said as certain as he could be, without seeing the killer's face. And then he added something that made her heart skip a beat. He said that if he was right, the killer might already be watching them, because anyone who played games with codes liked to see the other player struggle and fail before delivering the final blow. Riley did not want to believe it, but as she glanced toward the window, she caught the faint reflection of a dark shape moving across the street, someone standing still just far enough away to be hidden in shadow. And when she turned to look directly, the figure was gone, leaving only the empty sidewalk and the whisper of wind through the wet trees. Ethan noticed her change in expression and asked what she saw, but she shook her head, saying it was nothing, though in truth she felt a cold unease settling deep in her chest. She told herself it was just her mind playing tricks after a long day, but deep down she knew someone had been there watching and waiting. Ethan gathered the papers back into the file and handed it to her, saying they needed to visit the train station at first light before anyone else could disturb whatever clue the killer might have left. And Riley agreed, though her instincts told her the killer would not wait for them to come to him. As they left the cafe together, the rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet and shining under the dim streetlights, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked again, breaking the silence. Ethan walked beside her, his hands in his coat pockets, his mind clearly still turning over the numbers and patterns, while Riley kept glancing over her shoulder every few steps, convinced they were not alone. When they reached her car, Ethan paused before getting in and said something quietly, almost to himself, that made her heart beat faster. He said if the killer was watching, then the game had already begun, and neither of them could walk away now. And though she did not answer, she knew he was right, because the moment she saw how easily he pulled meaning from chaos, she understood that they were both already caught in something far bigger and far more dangerous than either of them had realized. The morning sky was pale and heavy with clouds as Riley drove toward the old train station, with Ethan sitting quietly in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead and his hands resting loosely in his lap, though she could see the small movements of his fingers tapping against his leg as if counting something in his head. The town was still waking up, the streets almost empty except for a few shop owners unlocking their doors and a man walking his dog along the sidewalk. And as they passed the edge of town, the buildings thinned out and the cracked road wound through trees whose leaves hung low and dripping from the rain the night before. And in the distance, the shape of the train station began to appear gray and weathered and standing alone like a shadow from another time. Riley parked the car a short distance away, not wanting to get too close in case anyone was watching, and they stepped out into the cool morning air, their footsteps crunching softly on gravel. As they approached the rusted fence that surrounded the station, the gate hung crooked on one hinge and squealed. As Riley pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness and making Ethan glance over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone following them. Inside the station, the air smelled of damp wood and rust, and the floor was littered with broken glass and old papers, the walls covered in graffiti from years of neglect. But near the far end, Riley saw something that did not belong there, a large shape covered by a dirty tarp, and beside it, drawn in thick red paint, was another set of numbers arranged in the same strange style as the others. Ethan moved toward the numbers, at once crouching to study them, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sequence, while Riley walked around the covered shape, her hand resting on the grip of her gun. Just in case, she reached down and pulled the tarp away, revealing an old metal bench beneath it, and on the bench a small cardboard box tied with black string and a folded piece of paper resting on top. She called to Ethan, and he came over, taking the paper in his hands and reading the short message written in neat block letters. It said 3 moves left, and the game ends, and Riley felt a cold prickle run down her spine as she realized this meant the killer had planned the ending from the very start. Ethan untied the string and opened the box. Inside was a small brass key and nothing else, and he turned it over in his hand, frowning, before slipping it into his pocket, saying they would figure it out later. But Riley could see in his eyes that he was already trying to guess what lock it might open. A faint sound broke the silence, then a soft creak of wood from the far side of the room, and both of them turned quickly toward it. Riley drew her gun and moved slowly in that direction, her boots making no sound on the dusty floor, while Ethan stayed just behind her, his eyes scanning the shadows. They reached a doorway leading into what had once been an office. The door hung slightly open, and sunlight filtered through the cracked blinds inside. But before they could step in, there was movement, a dark figure darting out through a side door and disappearing into the trees behind the station. Riley shouted and gave chase, her footsteps pounding against the ground as she ran. Ethan followed, though he was not as fast, and the figure stayed ahead, moving like someone who knew the area well, darting between trees and over fallen logs. Riley's breath came hard, but she pushed herself faster, determined not to lose sight of the shadow ahead, and for a moment she was close enough to see the shape of a hood pulled low over the figure's face. Then the figure vanished around a bend in the path, and when she rounded it, there was nothing, only the empty woods and the sound of her own breathing. She stood there scanning the trees, listening for movement, but there was none, and the only sign that anyone had been there at all was a small scrap of black fabric caught on a branch nearby. Ethan caught up moments later, and she showed him the fabric. His jaw tightened as he said the killer had wanted them to follow, but never to catch up, and that meant the chase was part of the game itself, a way to remind them who was in control. Riley hated to admit he was right, but deep down she knew it too. They walked back to the station in silence, both of them more aware than ever that they were being led somewhere, step by step, clue by clue, and that each move brought them closer, not only to the killer, but a danger neither of them could fully see yet. And as they reached the car, Ethan glanced back at the trees and said quietly that the killer had been watching them since yesterday and would not stop now. Riley started the engine and drove away from the station, the brass key in Ethan's pocket feeling heavier with each passing mile, and though the road ahead was clear, she kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a dark car following them. And when she caught her own reflection in the glass, she realized the game had already changed them both. The ride back from the train station was quiet and heavy with unspoken thoughts. Riley kept her eyes on the road, but her mind was turning over the strange message, the brass key, the shadow in the trees, and the way the killer seemed to stay one step ahead of them, always close enough to be felt but never close enough to be caught. Ethan sat beside her, staring out the window, his fingers tapping against the door in a slow, steady rhythm, like a metronome for his thoughts. When they reached his house, Ethan invited her in, saying he wanted to lay out everything they knew. So far, Lily was still at school, so the small home was silent except for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Riley followed him to the kitchen table, where he spread out the photographs and papers from the case alongside the scrap of black fabric and the brass key. Ethan picked up the fabric, turning it in his hand and studying the weave of the cloth. He said it looked like part of a glove, one designed for grip and movement, not warmth, which meant the killer had planned for speed when running through the woods. He set it down and picked up the key, holding it to the light, and noticing faint scratches near the teeth, he told Riley it had been used recently, maybe in the last day or two. Riley leaned over the table, pointing to the numbers from the train station wall and asking what he made of them. Ethan explained that the sequence was not just a date, but also coordinates, and that when he plotted them, they led to a warehouse near the docks, a place that had been abandoned for years, but was still owned by a shell company connected to one of the unsolved crimes from the pattern he had found earlier. Her gut told her they should go there immediately, but Ethan reminded her they needed to be careful. The killer wanted them to follow the trail, and walking in without a plan could mean walking into a trap. Riley hated waiting, but she knew he was right, so they agreed to go later that night under the cover of darkness, when fewer eyes would be on them. Hours passed slowly, and when the time came they drove together in her car. The streets near the docks empty, except for the occasional truck hauling cargo. The warehouse stood at the far end of a cracked road, its windows dark, and its metal siding streaked with rust. Riley parked in the shadows, and they approached on foot, the air cold and smelling faintly of salt from the water nearby. Ethan tested the brass key on the side door, and it turned smoothly. With a soft click, the door opened into darkness, and the sound of their footsteps echoed as they stepped inside. The beam of Riley's flashlight, cutting through the dust, filled air. The walls were lined with old crates and broken machinery, but what caught their attention was at the center of the room, a wall covered from floor to ceiling in photographs. Riley stepped closer, her breath catching, as she realized the photos were of her, of Ethan, and of Lily, some taken from far away, others disturbingly close, as if the photographer had been just a few feet from them in each moment. She saw Lily at school, Ethan at the cafe, herself at her apartment, at the bureau, even walking to her car at night. Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the wall, his voice low and controlled as he said the killer was not just playing a game, he was studying them, learning their habits, their movements, their weaknesses. Riley's hand tightened on her flashlight as her heart pounded in her chest. She had faced dangerous people before, but this felt different, more personal, more invasive. Then a voice echoed through the warehouse, calm and mocking, and carried by hidden speakers. It said, "You're too late. The next move is already in play." Riley spun around to try to find the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan stepped forward, calling out, asking what the killer wanted, but the voice only laughed and said, "All will be clear when the game ends." The lights flickered on, suddenly bathing the room in harsh white light and revealing a camera mounted high in the corner. Riley aimed her flashlight at it, but it was already pointing at them, capturing their every move. She reached for her radio to call for backup, but a sharp crack sounded overhead, and sparks rained down as the signal died in a burst of static. Ethan grabbed her arm and urged they leave now, before the killer decided to turn the game into something worse. They moved quickly back toward the door, but as they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them, and they realized the brass key was no longer in Ethan's pocket. It was gone, taken somehow, without him noticing, and in its place was a small folded card that simply read, "Next time bring her." Riley felt the meaning hit her hard. The killer wanted Lily, and now the game had taken a turn she had hoped to avoid since the beginning. She looked at Ethan and saw the fear in his eyes matched her own, not fear for themselves, but for the little girl now in the center of the storm. They got back in the car, driving away from the warehouse in tense silence, both knowing the truth in the shadows had been revealed. The killer was watching, always watching, and the next move would be the most dangerous yet. The night after the warehouse felt longer than any Ethan had ever known. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folded card the killer had left in his pocket, his hands gripping it so tightly the paper bent and creased. Riley paced across the room, her mind racing, as she thought of Lily and how close the danger had come. She had dealt with many criminals before, but this one played by rules no one else could understand, rules that turned every clue into a trap and every trap into a message. In the early hours, just before dawn, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number glowed on the screen. It said, "Solve this, and she lives." Attached was a photo of Lily sitting on a chair in a dimly lit room, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, and next to her on the floor was a sheet of paper covered in numbers and symbols. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and Riley leaned over his shoulder reading the message twice to be sure she had not misunderstood. The killer had taken Lily, and this was the final challenge. Ethan opened the image of the code, and his mind snapped into focus. Every number, every mark pulling at the corners of his thoughts. He recognized part of the sequence from one of the older crime scenes, but this time the pattern was broken in strange ways, as if the killer was daring him to spot the missing pieces. Riley moved quickly, calling in what little backup she could without risking Lily's life. She knew the killer was watching for police activity, and one wrong move could end everything. She told Ethan to work on the puzzle while she traced the signal from the phone, but he shook his head, saying the killer would never use a traceable device. This was about speed and precision, nothing else. Ethan's fingers flew over the notepad as he copied the code line by line, muttering numbers under his breath. He saw that each symbol represented a letter, and that the letters formed directions the killer had hidden inside the message. He circled a set of coordinates and told Riley they had to move now. There was no time to wait for anyone else. The place was close, maybe 20 minutes away, an old shipping yard near the river. They left the house in silence, the early light of morning breaking through the clouds. As they drove, Riley kept her eyes on the road, her grip tight on the steering wheel, while Ethan sat still, his mind locked on the thought of Lily alone and afraid. When they reached the yard, it was empty. At first glance, rows of rusted containers lined the cracked pavement, and the sound of water lapping against the dock filled the air. Ethan scanned the numbers painted on the sides of the containers and pointed to one near the end of the row. Its number matched the final line of the puzzle. They ran to it, and Riley tried the door, but it was locked tight. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of tools, a habit from his days working with locks and mechanisms. He worked quickly, and the door gave way with a screech. Inside, it was dark and smelled of metal and oil. Riley's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing Lily sitting in the far corner, her hands tied, but otherwise unharmed. She looked up, and the moment she saw her father, she began to cry. Ethan rushed forward, pulling her into his arms, whispering that everything would be all right. Riley kept her eyes moving, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, because she knew the killer would not make this easy. A sudden click echoed from somewhere above them, and a faint red light blinked on in the corner. Ethan looked up to see a small device attached to the wall, wires running from it to something hidden behind a crate. Riley moved fast, pulling the crate aside and finding a crude bomb wired to a timer counting down from 5 minutes. A note was taped to the front that read, "You win. If you leave alone, you lose if you stay together." Riley and Ethan exchanged a glance, understanding the cruel choice the killer was forcing on them, but neither of them moved to leave. Instead, Ethan told Riley to watch the timer. While he studied the wires, his mind working at lightning speed, he traced the connections and spotted a false circuit meant to trigger the device early if tampered with. He worked carefully, his hands steady even as the timer dropped below 2 minutes. At last he pulled a single blue wire free, and the red light went dark. The timer froze, and the device fell silent. Riley exhaled sharply, and Lily clung to her father's arm, shaking, but safe. Ethan held her close as they stepped out of the container into the cool morning air, the sun now breaking fully over the horizon. But as they reached the car, a small speaker hidden somewhere nearby crackled to life, and the killer's voice filled the yard, saying, "Well done, genius, you saved her. But the game is not over yet." And the sound faded, leaving only the wind and the sound of Lily's quiet sobs. Ethan looked at Riley, his jaw set and his eyes hard. They both knew the final move was still waiting somewhere just ahead, and the killer would not stop until they played it. The drive back from the shipping yard was silent except for the soft sound of Lily's breathing in the back seat, her small body pressed against the seatbelt. As she leaned toward the window, watching the city pass by, Ethan kept glancing at her through the mirror, making sure she was safe and real, and not just a fragile image in his mind. Riley kept her eyes on the road, but her thoughts were running in 100 directions, all leading back to the same truth: the killer was still out there. They reached Ethan's house just as the sun was high in the sky, the light falling warm across the front steps. Lily ran inside the moment the door opened, clinging to her father's arm and refusing to let go. Ethan walked her to her room, speaking softly until she finally curled up under her blanket and closed her eyes. Riley stayed in the kitchen, looking through the file one last time, searching for something they might have missed. When Ethan returned, his face was calm, but his eyes held a tired weight. She asked if Lily was all right, and he nodded, saying she would be fine, though it might take time for her to forget what had happened. Riley knew neither of them would truly forget. The killer's voice still rang in her ears, the promise that the game was not over yet. Ethan sat across from her at the table and pulled the brass key from his pocket, the same key that had been taken from him, and returned without explanation. He set it on the table between them, saying he still did not know what it opened. Riley picked it up, turning it in her fingers, and noticing something she had missed before, faint numbers engraved along the side. She wrote them down, and her eyes widened as she realized they were coordinates again, this time pointing to a location outside of town in the hills. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Ethan said they could go there now and finish this, or they could walk away. Riley studied him and saw the conflict in his expression, the need to protect Lily fighting against the need to end the threat for good. She told him that if they went there they would be stepping directly into the killer's hands, and he said maybe that was the only way to stop him. They left Lily in the care of a trusted neighbor and drove into the hills, the road winding through dry grass and scattered trees, until they reached a small clearing at the edge of a cliff. There in the center stood a single wooden chair, and on it sat a small black box with a note taped to the top. Riley approached slowly, the wind pulling at her coat as she took the note, and read it aloud. It said, "Congratulations, you have reached the end. Now choose what the ending will be." Ethan opened the box, and inside was a simple old-fashioned stopwatch and nothing else. He turned it over in his hand and saw a small speaker built into the back. As soon as he pressed the side, a voice came through, the same voice they had heard before, calm and almost amused. It said, "You solved every puzzle, you won every round. So here is your prize, one chance to end this game for good. Start the watch and find me before it stops, or you lose everything." Riley felt the ground shift under her as she realized the killer was nearby, watching them right now, waiting for them to start the chase. Ethan met her eyes, and without a word pressed the button. The watch began to tick loudly in the quiet air. They moved quickly back toward the car, scanning the trees and the rocks for any sign of movement, the sound of the ticking a constant reminder that time was slipping away. They followed the narrow road deeper into the hills until Riley spotted a figure standing on a ridge ahead, the hood pulled low over the face. The figure turned and disappeared behind the rocks, and they gave chase, climbing the uneven path until they reached a small cave hidden from view. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp stone, and in the center stood a man dressed in black, his hands empty and his head tilted as if amused by their arrival. "You played well," he said, "but games have to end." Ethan stepped forward, asking, "Why, Lily, why any of it?" And the man only smiled, saying, "Because you needed something worth fighting." For Riley moved fast, closing the distance and snapping the cuffs on his wrists. Before he could react, he did not resist, only laughed softly as they led him out into the sunlight. Back in town, the man was taken into custody, and for the first time in weeks the air felt lighter. Ethan stood outside the station, with Riley watching the clouds drift overhead. He turned to her and said, "I guess I solved your case." Riley smiled a little and replied, "And you stole my heart in the process." They walked back to his house together, where Lily ran out to meet them, wrapping her arms around her father's waist. Ethan lifted her into his arms, and for a moment all the danger and puzzles and shadows seemed far away, replaced by the simple warmth of family. Riley stood beside them, knowing the case was closed, at least for now, but also knowing she would never forget the man who had cracked the unsolvable and found something more than victory in the end.